Hello, welcome back to Janus Academy. This is our currently ongoing series on the general history of art. That's going to be 52 or perhaps 53 chapters. It may evolve as we progress. For the moment, we are at number 4. This is going to be the 4th lecture that is dedicated to Masque of la Roche-Cotard. Now, this is a very interesting item that, again, is one of those that predates anything that is present in general introduction to Western art done by Jensen, and this is something that takes us back tens of thousands of years in the past before Jensen begins his investigation. This one takes us back 75,000 years ago. This is a very interesting artifact that we're going to be talking about because it represents a mask that is made out of stone. Many different reasons make us think that this is an important artifact to discuss, and many different reasons make us think that it's interesting. One of those is the fact that chronologically speaking, it's situated within what we've established is the borderline of humanity. Now, we are talking about Homo sapiens at this particular moment, and we are talking about fully developed biologically, anthropologically, in any other way, humans. So this is no longer a hominid. This is no longer something that goes beyond the Homo genus. It is fully developed human. We have established that we can talk about fully developed humans physiologically and biologically speaking anywhere leading up to 300,000 years ago. But if we want to adopt an even stricter criteria, we can say that it's anything that falls within the realm of 100,000 years ago. We have repeated this many times, and we shall repeat it a couple more. The point is that if we go back 75,000 years ago, we are talking about the presence of humans as such. Now, this particular artifact was not necessarily made by humans as such. It was made by Neanderthals. And we can say that Neanderthals, as far as we know today, have gone extinct. They remain present to a certain effect because some people still have Neanderthal DNA present in them. Some people, when they do DNA analyses, they discover that they have different heritages. Amongst other things, they can discover traces of Neanderthal. Usually it's up to 3 or 4%, not more than that. But the whole idea is that Neanderthal lived and shared the space along with, the genus that would later become what we nowadays consider as humans. And this is something that gives us a very different inquiry and very different view into what we've considered to be the Neanderthal, because we have considered this species to be less intelligent and less developed than Homo sapiens. But we have, evidence, at least we have enough space to question this to a certain extent. What I'm trying to say here is that Neanderthal, who made this mask, was capable of abstract thought, which is necessary to create a tool. And I would argue that a mask is more sophisticated than a tool. We'll get to that. We'll be talking about masks in greater detail. But also, this suggests artistic usage. It suggests ritualistic usage. It suggests all these other things that masks are important for. Now, when we think about the place where this was located, we're talking about the riverbank of the Loire Valley, and we're talking about the particular settlement, a cavern, where this was created that was ornamented in a very intentional manner. We can talk of usage of color, which is really important. And we can say that the entire place really is in context with this particular findings. So it makes us think that this was possibly a part of a ritual. This was possibly a part of an activity that we thought Neanderthal was not necessarily capable of. So it gives us a glimpse into the possibility of the Neanderthal being more capable, more developed, more cerebral, or more conscientious than we originally thought. Now, this is really important because the mask we're talking about was probably not made to be worn, and this is how masks usually are. We'll give a certain importance to the fact that this is made out of stone, and then we have to go back, speaking about stone, to the fact that our initial tools were made of stone. We call the entire period the Stone Age. On this account, we think that stones have a lot to do with heavenly designs, with logos, with this whole idea of tools and intelligence that is needed to fashion and then use them, we have this strong tendency to connect stone as such to intelligence, to, as I said, logos. I thought really logos in its as it's translatable in its many ways as divine matter, as thought, as notion, as form, as all these things. Now, it is quite interesting to talk about all of this from the Christian, or if you will, post-Christian point of view, though I would prefer the appellation Christian, because we tend to associate logos with spirit. And we tend to associate logos with something that is abstract. But if we talk about it from this particular decidedly pre-Christian point of view, we are talking truly about stone, that in a Christian, especially medieval worldview, is the exact opposite of logos. It's something that represents matter as such. But if we go back to this particular period, we can say that tools were made of stone, statues, if we can talk about them as such, were made of stone, and then this particular item, a mask, was made of stone. We can truly suggest, therefore, that stone is divine and it is sacred. It's divine material that invites divine usage. And indeed, if we think about this, again, this is a very Christian perspective, if we think about the sacred as being intrusive in the material world, we think sacred as something that descended into the material world, we can look the usage of stones, and we can look, stones in general, as being that way. We already mentioned in previous videos the reference to Kubrick's and the Clarke's Space Odyssey, where this mysterious monolith appears and basically sparks the entire human evolution. It sparks what would end up becoming human civilization and human society. And this is something that we can attach to stones in general because of tools, because of everything else. Now, there is another important thing to say about this mask, something that makes it very different than the initial item that we started with, the Makapansgat pebble, that this was intentionally made. This is not a manuport. There is intent behind this, and again, we're talking about a face. Now, the difference between that pebble and this mask is that this is an intentionally made face, not the one that was recognized in nature, but the one that was fashioned. Again, unlike other masks, this was probably not made to be worn. Now, we're going to get into the description of the entire item in a minute, and we're going to be talking about what this mask is supposed to suggest. But if we assume that much like many other masks or usage of masks in general, it is to suggest that it has something to do with the divine, we can then say that this is the recognition of divinity in us, because we have faces, or it is to suggest divinity in the nature that surrounds us. And this really has a lot to do with, again, animism. It has a lot to do with animism being around for a speculated quantity of 100,000 years, which would therefore make this particular mask fall right into that chronology. Now, later on in this lecture, we're going to be talking about shamanism, that we cannot trace fully the 100,000 years to the past. From what I've latest read about this, we can talk about some 30,000 years in the past, but these are very fluid definitions. The point is that when we're talking about shamanism, and we'll get to that a bit later, we are mostly talking about masks. Masks are incredibly important in shamanistic practice and in shamanistic rituals. Now, we have a mask here that, again, takes us back far further than we originally thought. And this is kind of a leitmotif, I would say, of this course, at least for the first 10 or so lectures, that we are taking things much further in the past than what is the original practice, what is the, I would say, common practice, especially in comparison to Jansen. Now, the idea here is that we have this whole beginning of recognition of humans as divine, recognition of divinity inside us, which is really important, recognition of identity as such, recognition of the self. And this is something that would then take us to the possibility of art as such, because again, in another course that we have on this channel that is titled What is Art?, we go through many different questions and answers of what is art. And one of the more important ones, one of the more important theories or hypotheses in this regard, is that art has to do with the sacred. That one way or the other, it goes back to this whole idea of being a material manifestation of the sacred. Even if art in question is non-representative, or even if it's not material, even if it's performative, like you could argue, especially if it's performative, if we're talking about dancing or singing or other such things. Therefore, we are talking about the possibility of a divine creature. We are talking about the possibility of a hybrid creature, and this is something that we are going to elaborate as we go. Now, I want to give a brief description of this whole thing, which is really important for us to be able to properly address it. So we are talking about a mask that has, well, a partial appearance of a human face. And when I say the partial appearance of a human face, I'm talking about this idea that we can recognize either eyes or either the nose cavity. And the object in question is, again, very small. We are talking about roughly 10 centimeters in length, and we're talking about the weight of roughly 300 grams. Seeing how this is made of stone, that's not very heavy nor a very large object. Now, when you look at the mask, you can say that there are two different ways of interpreting it. You can either say that the openings of that we can see, so we can see basically a stone that has a hollow section through it, that has a bone driven through it. Now, you can either interpret this as eyes, which I think makes a lot of sense, and then you can see the diagonal part underneath it as nose, and then you can say that it's an upper part of the face, where the empty part below it would suggest the mouth cavity. So this is one way to look at it. I think this is a good way, and I think this is basically how a lot of interpreters see this. Now, a different way that I think is interesting, and we're going to cover a bit of it, is that we can look at the openings through which the bone is driven as the nose cavity. And I'll say in a minute why I think this is an interesting lecture of the whole thing. And then, of course, the bottom of it would be the mouth cavity. Now, I find this interesting because when we look at the biblical account of creation, we are talking about this whole idea of humans being created by God blowing a soul into their nose. And soul, and Latin is anima. At the same time as the soul, it means breath. So it's like this living force that animates us, that drives us. We are in motion on account of that. And the reason why I'm mentioning this, although it's obviously not really possibly it's not a nose, possibly these are eyes, but the reason why I want to mention the possibility of it being a nose is because we have a bone driven through it. And we have this really interesting assemblage of materials, because we know that bone is organic and stone is not. Bone comes from living organisms, it comes from, well, living beings, and stone is, well, inanimate. Unless we're looking at it in an animistic point of view where everything has a soul. But you get what I'm saying. This is quite interesting to observe from this point of view. But if we're going to go back to initial premise, which I think is correct, that we are looking at eyes and not nose cavity, then the same would apply, that we would have this idea of living eyes. And this would then go back to this whole idea of eyes being the mirror of the soul, which is something that we use to this day. We think that we can see someone's character, someone's identity, someone's intent, how they truly feel, etc. We can see all of these things in their eyes. Eyes are possibly the most expressive aspect of the human being and certainly of a human face. And this would make it so interesting in this particular case that we have the rest of the face be made of stone, but then the expressive part, the soulful part, is made out of a bone, which again is living tissue or comes from a living being. There is, this interesting thing to observe, that not only it's basically inanimate object, meaning formerly animate living being, but also the idea that we have this mixture of inorganic and organic matter. Now, this kind of takes us back to, my biology classes in high school, where we studied the origin of life on Earth, and when we studied this hypothesis that I think was proven since, that life itself was created when two inorganic matters met, and in presence of external force, let's say heat that may have come from volcanic eruption or from lightning, which would then make it very biblical and very interesting in that account. Two inorganic things connect and they create an organic matter, the proto-amino acid that would then be the origin of all life. Now, this is a very interesting thing, and this particular assemblage of bone and stone would make us think about this whole idea of origin of life itself. It would make us think about this clash between what is life and what is death. What is alive, or what used to be alive, I mean the animal out of which this bone came, and stone that we see as inanimate. Now, we have to be careful and we have to be aware of our own context when we're talking about these things, because again, we see stone as inanimate because we live in a predominantly Christian culture. When we look at churches and cathedrals, we see them as made of stone and glass. So we see stone and sunlight brought together. And the whole idea behind this is that light is the most mobile, the most animated and animating thing in the universe. It's the fastest thing in the universe, at least says so science, that speed of light is the fastest recorded speed, to my knowledge at least. And so we have this idea of life and mobility brought to idea of, death and immobility, stillness, inanimate state of affairs. Now, this is how we see it, but this is very possibly not how the people who created this mask saw it, be they Neanderthals or be they Cro-Magnons, because there are theories that this was created by Cro-Magnons and not Neanderthals. The running theory, however, is that it was most probably made by the Neanderthal. The idea is that they may have not seen stone the same way we did. They have not seen it as inanimate or as dull. Perhaps they saw it indeed as divine, and perhaps for them it made sense for this possibly ritualistic item or possibly sacred item to have been made that way is because it was stone. Now, even if this is the case, and it makes a lot of sense for me this to be the case on account of the whole veneration of stone and on account of us mostly making statues out of stone to this day, I would add that the whole idea behind this would then be the clash of stone and flesh, I mean bone in this particular regard. When I say flesh, I mean more of a general umbrella term for all the living tissue. Meeting of stone and bone, because you can turn this thing around and you can say that stone is something that suggests longevity. Stones will last thousands and tens of thousands of years. I mean, we have statues that are made of stone, made thousands of years ago. They're in perfect shape today. So you could say that it's the other way around, that the bones are there to symbolize fragility and the passing nature of life, whereas stones stand for stability and what we often associate with divine nature, very, very long lives. Not all cultures think that gods are immortal. In some cultures, gods are mortal and they die, and then we live in their flesh and we live in their corpses, and that's the whole thing. But there is this idea, of course, that gods are better and superior, and amongst other things, they live much longer than humans do. And if we are to connect this to the notion of stone being divine, we can say that it's the other way around. The bone that comes from the living world, the animated world, here stands for something that would represent death, and stone stands for something that would represent life. Now, in this regard, it would be interesting to look at this as basically a assemblage of life and death. And if we are to assume that this whole thing is sacred, the image of sacred, the representation of sacred for the individual that made it and for the culture they belong to, then we could say that in this particular regard, sacred would be the transitional state between life and death. The transitional state between something that is temporal and something that is permanent. Something that is, of this world and something that enters the other world. So we would have this whole idea of temporary existence and permanent existence. Temporary existence obviously being represented by bone, because we know that we don't really see bones in nature on their own. We have to, well, in most cases, kill an animal, then skin it, then remove its flesh, and then get to the bone. But very rarely do we actually see bones out in the open. The whole point with all of this is that we have the meeting of life and death, these two principles. And it takes us back to something we've considered when we were talking about previous items in this course, them being basically all about the meeting between two realms and question of longevity and the question of separation from nature in this regard. Now, why am I talking about the questions of longevity, questions of life and death when it comes to separation from nature? Well, because we have this assumption that animals that are a part of nature, that have not separated themselves from nature like the humans have, are not necessarily aware of their mortality. We humans have the elevated consciousness of, well, the world as such and of ourselves in the world, and so we are aware of our mortality. This is a very long topic and a very broad topic. We can't really open it right now. To which extent we are aware of our mortality, to which extent we are capable of accepting it or embracing it. But let's say that in theory we are. And the animals are not, which make animals in a way immortal in their own worldview, in their own consciousness, because they're not aware of their deaths. They're not aware of the necessity of death, so they live as if they were immortal. Of course, they're not immortal, but in their own mind, in their own feeling and experience of the world, they are. In this particular regard, we can make a really big deal out of a question then, to go back to it, and ask ourselves, is this a face of a human or is this a face of an animal? And so is the fact with the first item in this whole course, in this whole inquiry, that we cannot tell. This is just too abstract and too general that it can easily be either a face of a human or a face of an animal. We just don't know. And while we can be certain that when we're talking about this particular stage of humanity, of humanity's development, we can assume with a fair amount of certainty that we are beginning to distinguish ourselves from animals. That this is no longer 3 million years ago where we're saying, okay, we don't know to which extent these people or proto-people were aware of them being separate from the animal world. I mean, if we're talking about something that was 75,000 years ago, we can say that probably it already was. Now, I want to mention, since we're talking about life and we're talking about immortality or self-perceived immortality, I want to mention the question of longevity as such, because one thing that humans have as compared to most animals, not all of them, but most of them, is longevity. We tend to live much longer lives than horses or dogs or, well, chicken, bad example, cats or other such animals. Now, you could say that other animals like turtles, they can live very long lives. Lobsters can live very long lives, but these are exceptions to the rule rather than the rule itself. Humans are, well, they live much longer lives than most of the animal world. This is not necessarily the case if we go back 75,000 years in the past. You could say that life, especially for the Neanderthal, is quite short and is shorter than most lives are today, especially if we're talking about today, meaning the industrial circumstance and the industrial stage of our human development, where we have antibiotics and we have hospitals and we have all these other things, medicine that prolong our lives. But in this particular stage, in this particular period of human history, life is much shorter, and I think we can be safe to say that on average life doesn't really last longer than 30 years. It's a bit of a rarity. In this particular period, if you have someone that's older than 30 years, you treat it as, well, an exception, and you generally find this individual to be incredibly valuable because they have a lot of experience, because if they were alive for that long, that means that they were either incredibly skilled, which makes them valuable for their experience and all of it, or they were incredibly lucky, which then makes them valuable because they obviously have some sort of divine protection or favor with them. But at any rate, you could argue that this society treated its elderly completely different than we have, because they were indeed precious. They were in a way, a living history. If your lifespan is much shortened, you have a very different idea of history. And we want to, speaking of longevity or shortness of life, we want to bring this together and talk about it, adding to the mix one incredibly important prehistoric event that almost ended the human race and such. And what we're talking about is the Toba volcano eruption, or supervolcano eruption. Now, this is something that happened 74,000 years ago, so this is very close to, well, 75,000 years ago when we date this mask. And I don't know to which extent we can be entirely certain that this mask was before the Toba eruption. Perhaps it was roughly around the same time. But let's just say that the numbers we have are 75 and 74,000 years in the past. Why is this so important? Well, this is what is argued by most anthropologists and most archaeologists. This is a catastrophic event that almost ended the human race. And analyzing human genome, we came to determine that we have this so-called genetic bottleneck, that the human population dwindled down considerably. Some estimates go down to 10,000 units, whereas some go as low as 1,000 units. So this is to say that around this particular period, the entire human population in the world dwindled down to anywhere between 1,000 to 10,000 individuals. Now, this is an incredibly small number of people, and you can see how close we got to complete extinction. Now, compare this to the estimate that today we have 8 billion people alive on this planet, that back in the day we came so close to basically disappearing. Which again, if you think about a lot of the Homo geni that didn't make it, that did disappear, the same thing could have relatively easily happened to us. Now, I invite you to, well, do your own research when it comes to the Toba super eruption and the effects it had on the global climate, the effects it had on vegetation, on other animals, on other species. It's all very interesting, and it's all basically there to make us think about fragility of life. There is this entire other study that has to do with development of planet Earth, and the assumption is that life as such, not just humans, but all of life, so all of holobiont, went completely extinct 4 times. Meaning that if Earth is an estimated, let's say, 4.5 billion years old, when I was in high school, what we were taught was that it was 3.9 billion. I guess in the meantime, this whole thing changed a bit, so now we got to the number of 4.5 billions. I mean, it's a lot of time, both of those numbers are. And the idea is that in this period, all of life, all of existence as such, ended and then began anew 4 times over. So this is kind of a frightening prospect. I guess you could either find it optimistic or pessimistic, depending on your point of view. Even if we come to destroy this planet in a nuclear holocaust, yeah, we'll just start over. Not we, but the protozoa that brought us to here. So it's all fine in the end. But the point is that this is an important thing to address, because we have a mask that, again, possibly tells one version of the story of life and death, happen very close, I mean, chronologically speaking, very close to this super eruption that has the capacity to end all of human life. So I just find it necessary to mention it, because if you're thinking about the generally adopted depiction of death in today's culture, but going back, thousands of years, you could say that it's the depiction of a skull, the human skull. We go back to bones. Basically, in this particular context, the bones can either represent life, because the bone is inserted into stone, but the way we know bones and the way we symbolically use bones, for example, I mean, the most famous example, obviously, being the pirate's flag, the Jolly Rogers, we see a skull and then 2 crossed bones. But you could say that the skull alone is enough of a symbol. It's evocative enough. And then you can say, yes, you're looking at a skull that has hollow eye sockets and that has a hollow nose and mouth cavity. So in this regard, bones would signify death. They would signify absence of life. And in this regard, we can say that stone perhaps is life, whereas bone is death. But you can easily flip it around, and you can easily then talk about this being sacred in this particular regard, because it takes us back to what is sacred by definition. Super reality is one of those instances. Many people connect sacred and super reality to sacrificial mechanism, to ritualized violence, and to the very presence of death. The most sacred moment would be, ritualistically speaking, the moment where the animal, or human, if we're talking about human sacrifice, is being killed, when the life is leaving their body. And it's this very transitional state between life and death that we see as the most sacred affair. Because again, if we see sacred as being divine intrusion into the material world, we are talking about the transitional action and the transitional situation between these two realms. And if we have stone that is stone that is pierced by a bone, we are talking about this, animate and inanimate objects coming together. Now, I want to talk about this whole thing when it comes to, obviously a mask, because it's in the title of not only our lecture, but the title of this item is The Mask of La Roche-Cotard, and it's, the whole story of anthropology of a mask and its usage. Now, we won't have nearly enough time to get into the greater detail, but we have to mention how we see mask as it is nowadays. And we have to just kind of quickly go through the main alleys, really the main avenues of thought when it comes to what a mask is. And of course, we always have to keep reminding ourselves that these are all assumptions. We are still talking about period of time where we have no written records of pretty much anything, so we are basically giving a lot of assumptions without the capacity to absolutely confirm something in a stern scientific manner. But the whole point with the mask and anthropology of the mask that is so important for arts in general, a lot of the 20th century art is directly inspired by masks. We can talk about Modigliani, we can talk about Brancusi, about Picasso. I mean, these are just the biggest examples of people who were not only inspired by masks, but dedicated their entire careers to artistically treating and dealing with this particular phenomenon. Well, the first thing that we can think about the mask is that it's a sort of an identity swap. That when you, let's say, go to war, you will, in many cultures, you will either take on a mask. You can see this, for example, in Japan with their demon masks that they incorporate into their armors. And you can see a lot of this even in medieval armors, that they would have masks, not only for protection, but also as a way of assuming a different identity. Now, what is the deal with this? Well, you live your civilian life, you go about your daily duties, and then there comes a time for you to go to war. Going to war means committing gruesome acts of violence, or having those acts committed upon you, or in many cases both. So this is a traumatic thing. It's a traumatic thing to, hit or bruise or murder another human being, or any being, I would argue. And of course, it's also traumatic if all of those happens to you. Meaning that if you go to war, you're going to an altered state of mind, and you are becoming a different person. Now, you need to become a different person if you want to exert all this violence, and if you want to, be successful in war, because the idea is that you want to exert this violence over someone else and not have it done over you. But then you don't want to carry that violence back to your community. You want to go back to your community, and you want to go back to being a civil, meaning being civilian, meaning being docile. And you don't want this aggression and this, bloodlust and this berserk, if you will, qualities in your civilian life, because then that's going to be no good. You're going to disrupt your entire community. You're going to lead to major crises. You have to find a way to basically leave this aggressive, violent behavior on the battlefield. And what you do then is you basically assume a different identity. You put on a mask where you look at the whole thing as a daimon. And I say a daimon quite intentionally, not a demon. I can explain the difference later, and I probably will. So you become someone else. You assume a completely different identity, and then you go and you do what has to be done. And if you're lucky enough to come back, you remove the mask, or you wash off your war paint. Really, it has a very similar function and role. And then whatever happened on the battlefield stays with the mask. So it's this idea that you become someone else. You assume a different identity, you assume a different persona, and you go and you do what needs to be done. Now, this is obviously the case where we, do an invocation of the sorts. Where you go to war, you do an invocation of a said daimon, and it's a very similar activity to basically being creative in Greek society. Where if you wanted to, let's say, write a poem, you would begin that poem with an invocation, where you would ask a muse of poetry to possess you and to give you creative power to write whatever it is that you wanted to write about. I mean, the famous beginning of the Iliad is Homer saying, "Please, muse, grant me the power to sing of Achilles, sons of Peleus, and his famous rat," and as the story goes. The whole idea being that when you create, it's not you that's doing the creative part. It's really the muse that possesses you, that takes over your body, and then this creative surge runs through you. And you're basically used by this higher daimonic, divine, if you will, power and authority. It's the same thing in war. It's like, okay, I'm going to put this daimon mask on. I'm going to be possessed by, let's say, Ares, the Greek god of war. I'm going to go and do these atrocious acts of violence. But then when I remove the mask, aggression is removed from my body, from my persona, and it's all good. I can go back to my regular civilian existence. Not entirely sure if this works. I mean, you could argue that in today's world, when soldiers put on a uniform, it's a very similar affair. I mean, of course, uniform many times is there to protect you if you have, protective gear. If you are, let's say, a policeman and you're involved with suppressing riots, you will wear a lot of protective gear, and a lot of that gear is not going to be there just to protect you from stones or Molotov cocktails or whatever is that the protesters can throw at you. But it's also to conceal your identity. And it's also so that when you're, kicking someone or punching them or hitting them with a stick or with a baton, or if you're committing these, acts of aggression, so that they don't see you, so that they don't see the human face. They see like this kind of a mechanized but definitely suppressed identity, non-individual hitting them. So it's like this invisible or rather indistinguishable notion of state authority that is beating them down, not an actual person. And this is to protect the identity of the police officer that is, breaking our protests and breaking someone's ribs or, breaking in someone's skull, but caving in someone's skull. But it's also so that we disassociate this violence from the person, so the state itself, breaking our ribs. And it's this whole idea of swapping of identity, but it's also the idea of mask as authority. And this is, present, not arguably, factually to this day. That again, if we're to stay with this example, a police officer will, punching you in the midst of the of protests, you are not to have this idea of another human being hitting you, because then it's a personal thing. You can be angry at that human being, you can perhaps seek revenge or whatever other thing, but if this is like a faceless entity that is hitting you, then it's like, okay, I guess the entire state is against me, the entire oppressive apparatus of the state, if you will. And that's a completely different thing, and you cannot really channel your anger towards something concrete. It just then dissipates. And you could say that using a mask, this is a very banal example, but I think it's quite efficient. Using a mask, therefore, can be, and oftentimes is, invocation of higher authority. Again, as a police officer, you're hitting someone because you have the law behind you. You're enforcing the state's system of rules and regulations, and the mask is there to conceal your identity, and in a way, not just conceal it, but suppress it. You really are not yourself when you do it. You are an instrument of the state. Again, if you act as a police officer in this regard. And if you act as a soldier in war, it's kind of the same thing. You're shooting at other masked people, and if you kill someone, this is someone supposed to kind of make light of the fact. We know this from literature. If you read any war novels or war accounts, that people are not that troubled just shooting at the enemy. So it's like, yeah, it's the enemy, we need to fight them. But then if they see the enemy, if they actually see their human face, and if they're met with fear and anxiety and desperation and all these other things that abound in warfare, then they have this almost a nervous breakdown, and it's like, oh my God, I've killed a human being. Like, this person has family, they may have kids, they may have a wife, they have parents, all these things, and you're confronted with the human cost of your actions. And it's a very hard thing to do. Again, I've read about it, I haven't really experienced it myself. The point being that all of these things are concealed using a mask. Now, you can think about this not only when it comes to war or a civil war or demonstrations or protests or what'll have you, but also if you think about your social status. You think about, for example, how in Rome, mask really was connected to this whole idea of persona, that a mask was really who you were, and it's a completely different thing. Because in Roman optics, who you were was not this stoic or post-stoic idea of your treasured individual life or your immortal soul. No, you basically existed in your society, and you were a person who could exert a certain amount of power, influence, and agency. So this is who you were. Your public persona was who you were. And if you're thinking about a mask being a persona, you think about the Roman custom of present amongst finer families of Rome, that you would have mortuary masks of your ancestors kept in the family lararium, which is like a space dedicated for house spirits and protective house deities. And there you would have the lineage of your ancestors, and you would have their masks. So sometimes you would wear these masks around as a way of projecting your social capital. In a way saying, I am all of these things, these are my ancestors, this is my family, and this is who I am deeply, and not only deeply inside, but overtly on the outside. It's this whole idea then that you're not swapping identity, you are this identity. And I would say that this is a bridge between these two different ways of looking at a mask, because you become this thing. When you put on a mask, the whole thing only works if you truly become this thing. And I would argue that it's a very interesting way of externalizing your identity, this whole idea that you can assume identity. And this really then takes it back to what we mentioned at the beginning, that this particular mask was made by the Neanderthals. And you see that while we're talking about masks, how different and complex their usage can be in society, whether if it's a practical mask, which it wasn't because it's too small to be really worn on a human face, but even if it's just a representation, we're then talking about the practical versus symbolical. And this very dilemma speaks of a certain level of elevation in consciousness that we tend to not really attribute to the Neanderthals. We can say that having a mask is actually a very elevated sign of culture, a very elevated sign of, proto-civilization, if you will. Now, there is this whole idea, of course, of mask and its usage in ritual, which is really important, that be it a shamanistic or a totemistic ritual, a mask really is a very important part of the whole thing. Now, this takes us to, the sacrificial ritual is one of the more important ones, if not the most important one, and it also takes us to the theater. Now, this is a really important thing, that theater masks in Greece have shamanic origins, and that actors who are on stage really enact shamans. So it's a terribly important thing to understand. Now, when you think about the shamanic origin of a theater mask, and you think about the whole ritualistic and performative notion of a mask, you come to understand that if you are partaking in a sacrificial ritual, that has a very important meaning, and it has, the role of progenitor of most of our society and culture. Now, I have to go back to a seminal essay, incredibly important, incredibly influential, that was written by Sigmund Freud under the title of Totem and Taboo, where he argues, these two things. He argues the notion of taboo that is really important for us if we're talking about the mask being both life and death and being somehow transitional between life and death. He talks about the term of taboo as basically meaning both of two very different things. It's generally a term that signifies exclusion and a buffer zone that is not to be breached, but for different reasons. We are not to breach taboo either because it's incredibly sacred or because it's incredibly profane, or both at the same time. This is what you get with most of the sacred items or most of the sacred situations, that it's both of those things at the same time. Meaning that taboo can either be applied to a divine being or a divine space or a divine item, the sacred item that you're not supposed to touch, you're not supposed to approach for your own safety, really. And let's say an incredibly putrid corpse that you're also not supposed to approach and certainly not supposed to touch because you're going to get a potentially deadly disease. And this is the same word. It's the same term that designates both of these situations of something that is incredibly elevated and something that is incredibly lowly. But it's the same word. It's the notion of taboo. And it's this idea that what happens in theater, according to Freud, so massive spoilers, this is the very end of Totem and Taboo, is that we essentially have, as Freud argues, a sacrificial mechanism. We have the initial theater with the Greeks be a sacrificial mechanism where we know that at the very beginning of theater we have one actor, the protagonist, and then we have the choir. Protagonist is arguing, he is complaining that he is suffering and he's going through these terrible situations in his life, and then the choir is responding and basically explaining to him why he's suffering. And he's saying, well, I didn't deserve this and I'm a good person. And they say, well, you've committed this heinous crime even if you were not aware of it, but this is how you got to where you are. And what Freud is arguing is that this is basically the community explaining to a person that is to be sacrificed why they are to be sacrificed. They're justifying themselves in a way with their victim of why they are executing them, him or her, but for some reason we always think that it's him. And this is a very important thing because when it comes to masks being used in Greek theater, we have this whole idea of the person speaking, the sacrificial offering, if you will, is speaking through a mask. We know that the Greek actors wear masks. Now, this is also important because it's not just present in Greece. It's present in Roman Saturnalia, for example, where in these, very rampant and lubricious festivities, Saturnalia, you drink a lot of wine, you fornicate, and you do all these things that you would not normally do during a year. Sometimes you would have election of slaves or criminals or other, let's say, outcasts from the society that would be masked. They would be given royal honors. They would be treated, like the most elevated, most honorable members of the society. And then at the end of the festivities, they would be executed. And this is a very interesting thing. Now, you could compare this to a certain extent with two interesting things. One of them would be the medieval carnival, where they would elect the ugliest or the most deformed or the most mentally challenged individual, and then they would parade them around as the king of the carnival. Because the whole idea of both the carnival and Saturnalia was the inversion of the societal order. It was to celebrate what is lowly and to suppress what is usually celebrated. These were the periods where you could offend a figure of authority without some considerable danger to yourself. Or when you could curse in public, or where you could basically turn the social order upside down. Now, another line of development here is this whole idea that we're going to come back to when we start talking about cult of Ishtar, the whole idea of royal sacred marriage between Babylonian king and goddess Ishtar. So let's say that the king is assuming a role of Damuzid, Damuzid being the human lover of goddess Ishtar that we know is brutally murdered, gored to death, really, and that indeed serves as a sacrificial offering. Now, again, we have this whole idea of hieros gamos, the sacred marriage between a human, a mortal, and a goddess that is immortal. So there we also have this idea of life and death, that is death and life, coming together. Again, if you want to come back to this particular mask, stone and bone, or bone and stone, both work as we described, and this whole transitional idea that is the sacred transition between two realms, two different states. Now, the idea behind this was that the king was actually a sacrificial offering. That idea is that you always offer to sacrifice the very best your community has to offer. And the idea is also that the king is responsible for its community, meaning that if a harvest fails, you're going to sacrifice the king to appease the gods. Partially on account of that, but partially on account of, wanting to punish the person who is responsible, is like a sacrificial offering, quite literally. And it's this idea that if you want to become a king, you have to assume that responsibility. You have to be ready to sacrifice yourself, to give up your own life for your own community. And of course, you have to do this in the most gruesome way imaginable, which is pretty much how Damuzid was killed and how Adonis was killed. In Greek myth, we have this direct transplant from Babylonian myth. The story of Adonis and Aphrodite is very similar to the story of Damuzid and Ishtar. And we'll talk about it in greater detail when we get to that. But the whole point is this assumption of a different identity, the assumption of a different role that you exert by putting on a mask. And if we're talking about this whole mask being involved in transitional states, which is the whole notion of the sacred, transition between the realm of divine and the realm of human, or later that becomes the realm of spirit and the realm of matter. But let's say that since we're talking about very, very strongly pre-Christian times, we're going to stay with this appellation. We're also talking about rite of passage. Masks, of course, are instrumental in rites of passage. And this can be a rite of passage from childhood to adulthood, or it can be a rite of passage from being in celibacy and moving into marriage, or it can be a rite of passage, well, literally between life and death. Like you could argue a funeral is a rite of passage in a way, and many other such examples. We have all rites of passages codified into our society. I mean, to this day. Let's say you are hired in a company, you're fired from a company, you get to graduate. That's a very important rite of passage, something that has to do with your maturity. You go to a bachelor's party, that's a rite of passage. Like, hen's party, that's a rite of passage. Like all of these different codified manners that speak of this, changing of regimes, that speak of, transitional states. And masks are all important in this. We can also go back to famous carnivals, like the one in Rio de Janeiro, like the one in Venice. In Venice, the whole idea behind wearing masks was that this highly hierarchical and highly vertical society would revert to some sort of equality that was only around for the duration of the carnival. Now, all of this is to say that these are later developments of usage of a mask and how masks are used and what their anthropological potency is. But the point that we're trying to make here is that this may all have developed from a situation that was present in our society much before than we ever thought. Now, I want to make because this is a history of art course, I want to make a connection not only with the masks and how incredibly influential they were to the 20th century art when it comes to, Modigliani and Picasso basically painting masks rather than human faces, but also the whole idea of an assemblage, the notion of a collage. That also is important for the same person, said Picasso, but many other artists, that we bring together different materials, we glue them together, hence the term collage. It comes from French coller, which is the glue. And then we make works of art like that. You could argue that this is not necessarily collage because no glue was used, but an assembly piece used, made from different materials. And those materials have a very strong, symbolically potent role. Now, we already made the connection between 20th century art and the first item in our investigation, the pebble of Makapansgat. But we can see that this is something that persists, that we keep coming back to, modern art on one end, and then this prehistoric art on the other. There's a connection. There's like this cyclical notion in history of art that, especially from, I would say, late 19th, early 20th century on and onwards, we keep going back to our roots. We're trying to go back and discover and better understand and better define the roots of humanity. And I think this is something that is very important to understand. Now, since we are running out of time, there is one last important thing to mention, and this cannot be overstated, the nature of the stone that was used to create this. And the stone in question was flint, that we know is used to create fire. Neanderthals used flint by basically scratching it or hitting it against other stones so that they would produce sparks, so that they would produce fire. Now, this is immensely important. You think about them creating a mask out of a material that generates fire. And we spoke about fire in previous lectures. We spoke about how incredibly important and instrumental fire is to the development of humanity, how we got our large brains on account of fire and on account of cooking, how it's basically what makes us civilized. And we have this whole idea that fire is integrated into the very notion of identity as such. Now, this cannot be accidental, I think. I mean, it's just too perfect to be haphazardly made of flint. I think when we're talking about meeting of bone and stone, that this has to have meant not something, but a lot. The entire thing, I think, had to have been defined by the fact that it's made out of flint. And that this is used not only as material that is used to make tools, stone, not to get into all of that, again, that entire tangent, but it's also the tool that we use for fire. That is an incredibly important tool in itself, instrumental for development of humanity. It's if you have like a fire elemental or a fire entity, you could argue that flint is in a way fire condensed and something that generates fire, and incredibly important as such. Now, I don't think we can properly understand this item if we don't include the fact that it was made from flint, and if we don't include that into our attempt to reconstruct the possible meaning and the possible usage that this particular mask have had for the people that made it and then they used it. I would also like to mention, because we are at the very end of this, that this particular site was, again, recently discovered, and this mask was in silence for, 75,000 years, and it just waited there, and it kind of had the entire history of art and civilization and everything that happened in between unraveled without us knowing it. It's not necessarily something that is included in our development. It's not like we were aware of this for the previous 75,000 years. No, we only recently came to discover it at the end of the 20th century. And just something to think about. This is something that we're going to use when we start talking about the next item in our list. And this is going to be Lovenmensch, the lion man that was 40,000 years old. And that with this, we are starting to approach what most art histories include as the very first artistic object, whatever that may mean. I thank you for your attention. I hope this whole thing made sense, and I'm looking forward to seeing you soon. Ciao.